Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out despite this weather. And I would welcome you to my masterclass and jump right into it. There we go. So first of all, I would like to tell you guys, just as a quick disclaimer, that I have low-key tricked you guys all here because I am not a fashion photographer. I am just a photographer that tends to use fashion occasionally in my work as a tool for storytelling. Now, what I'm about to show you are images that I personally think aren't necessarily very popular in mainstream when we think about fashion photography, especially when it comes to fashion photography as a business commercially. It is, what I'm showing you is an example of what could be and what I believe fashion photography should be more of outside of, you know, being commercial and trying to make sales and making pretty images. But before I jump into that, I would like to give a quick introduction on myself. Quick backstory, this is just me at home in Aba, where I was raised until I was 16. I moved to the States where I studied cultural anthropology and African studies. And at that time, it really translated to what are you going what are you going to do with that? But to cut a very long story short, I decided after school and maybe a few years of trying to hustle in the States, it wasn't for me. And I decided to come back to Nigeria and move to Lagos because Aba at the time really wasn't an option in terms of building a viable career that I wanted for myself with photography. In Lagos, this is where I discovered a true love for photography. And what's interesting is, even though I've built a career now mainly in photojournalism, is I got my start in fashion photography. That was my first foot into photography in Lagos. I was invited or introduced to a friend by a friend to photograph backstage at Lagos Fashion Week. And from there, that's sort of how word of mouth started building up in terms of getting jobs. A lot of my earlier clients were with luxury stores such as Alara and Temple Muse and creating a lot of the images for their social media, for their websites. And even though these stores had a very particular sort of branding style, it didn't necessarily work for me because they were fairly trying to represent different various luxury brands while also setting themselves apart as luxury stores. But for me, I wanted more. So I turned back into street photography. I went into documentary. I moved to Liberia, and that is where I ended up just building a foundation for my career. And that's essentially what I would like to share with you guys today is it's not fashion photography. It's once again, the baseline for this is storytelling. And in my case, how can we use fashion and elements of fashion to tell a story? So what we're going to cover real quick and what I like to do is I'm not a big fan of public speaking, but I do love sharing. And also, side note, part of the reason why I'm standing on stage is because my dad is visiting and and he has never really seen my work ever. So this is the first visit he's had where he's actually gets to see my work and hear me talk about my work. Oh, okay, Daddy, sure. So I'm also taking this as an opportunity to, the parental pressures of, see how well I'm doing, Daddy. Okay, so what I would want to share with you guys is storytelling. What is your story? I'm not going to assume what everyone out here does. It could be fashion, it could be photography, it could be something within the creative sector. That's fine. But I think in all elements of whatever you do, especially creatively, there has to be a personal story in it. So I'll break it down with personal. Personal doesn't necessarily mean, sharing your deepest, highest joys and your darkest traumas. It just means working and creating with intent, with something that matters to you. It doesn't necessarily have to be about you. It just has to matter to you. The second bit is don't just create, build an archive. This is something that I have used continually throughout the years. Um, who are you creating for? Why are you creating? Are you creating, in my case, images just for the sake of churning it out for certain consumers? Or are you creating for a legacy? Are you creating work that people can remember? Are you creating work that people can reference? And then the umbrella of all of this, and this is thankfully, I think what my background in photojournalism has given me, is that you have to care. You really have to care about the stories that you're creating, even if it's for clients. I mean, at the end of the day, we're living in a capitalist world. I get it. Their job offers on the table. There's money on the table. We don't necessarily want to leave it, but baseline is you create better work when you care about it. It's just really that simple. I'm going to start off with giving some examples of some of the projects I've done in the past. Personal projects, and also just getting the attachment of our personal work into it. It doesn't have to be just biographical. It can be cultural, it can be emotional, it can be spiritual. And it doesn't have to be, once again, it doesn't have to be about you when we're talking about personal. It has to be something that, yes, you're connected to in some way so that you can create the work. So there's some sort of attachment to it. An example of this is for a body of work I did. This image is from a project called Beauties of West Point. And this, funnily enough, I photographed this for Vogue some years back. And this started off based off a personal experience and a memory that I had where I just got a job in Monrovia in Liberia. And I was very green as a documentary photographer. I wasn't exposed to a lot in that sort of field. And West Point happens to be a very congested slum. And I remember trekking there for the first time. It was raining, there was like open toilets nearby, there were like feces and all these other things like flowing, and I was trying to photograph my environment and being careful of where I stepped. But then I looked up and I remember very well, this woman standing underneath a bit of shelter with this piece of zinc jutting out, and the water is like falling like a curtain in front of her. And she had like a bob cut of dark green braids. And then she had bright, bright blue lipstick and then pink eyeshadow that had sort of been smeared across her eyelids. And she had this like very tight body hugging pink dress. And she was so beautiful that, I stopped and, just that visual of that front of her being covered by the rainwater and the pattern that the zinc roof was making. And I was just like, how absolutely gorgeous, And what stood out to me more than anything was what she was wearing and how she was representing herself. It was an expression of who she was that made me even forget about the environment that I was in. So I went ahead and created a project because West Point was a community I ended up working in for about 8 to 9 months. And I ended up creating this project for Vogue, which really just represented how people dressed in their everyday. So some of us looking at these images, we might say like, oh, they're just wearing their at-home clothes or their everyday sort of clothes. But to them, it was very intentional in terms of what they chose to put on is how they wanted to be seen. And when it comes to fashion, fashion is an expression of culture. Fashion is an expression of identity. And when we look at working even with brands or people who are creating new ideas, I personally have gotten a lot of information, a lot of experience by first of all looking at real everyday people. The next example I would give was for a story I did with National Geographic for On the Sappers of Brazzaville. Some of you might be aware of like their male counterparts in the DRC, where they're known for their dandyism and their sharp clothes. But I really wanted to document the women as well. These women are hairdressers, are police officers, are teachers. But every now and then they put on their very well-tailored suits, and what they carry with them. When we talk about culture, especially on the continent, it doesn't necessarily mean clothes like what I'm wearing, for example, where you're like, that's giving indigenous a little bit or something. It's also about the history of clothes. So you can look at an image like this and see, something that has a very strong Western influence. But there's a reason for that, how they could take what was a negative they were seeing from their quote unquote so-called colonial masters and take these clothes and make it their own and have their own stories with them. So when I photograph, I would want people to also imagine the personal stories that go with this. It's not just about the suit and tie and the extra like flair that they're given, but when we look at people wearing what we would see as everyday clothes, we should also have the question of what are you trying to convey? What were you feeling when you put this on? What's the story behind that? This is just an image for you guys to look at, quite honestly. I love this one. So the women go around, when they put on their suits, they go through their community and they have this sort of flair and dance where they show off their suits. They do a little leg shimmy to show off how shiny their shoes are, and that those little elements, that is culture. That is an expression of identity. And I think there's so much individual stories, once again, that we can focus on just by looking at everyday people and then maybe drawing some inspiration from that. This for me is a big element of using fashion in storytelling, is archiving. What are you preserving? Who are you honoring? What happens to your work after it's created? How long do you want your work to live? Are you just going to snap a picture, put it out on Instagram, or send it to a client and that's it? What's the story behind it? So with this example I want to share is for a commission I did with Vlisco, where they approached me and they wanted, in collaboration with some other artists and the two Igbo designers here, to create something strongly around Igbo culture. And now when they approached me with this, I had my reservations because I was just like, Lisco has a bit of a history there when it comes to the colonial times and their trading history. Do I really want to give, what do I want to give them? It feels like I'm giving them something in terms of Igbo identity and expression. But what can I give myself? What can I give other people? So what I decided to do with this was to address two elements of Igbo identity and expression, which was the female husband wives. I think there's a proper title for that. There's the husband wives and then the art of Uli. But I also wanted to embed certain elements of nostalgia right down to the bathroom slippers. I didn't want it to be just like a pretty image. I wanted people to look at it and see layers to it, see more than clothes. And when I created these images, one thing that I don't want us to underestimate is a digital footprint. As someone who's been, a digital baby for quite some time, from Blogspot and Tumblr, I love a good digital footprint. And there is a purpose with this when it comes to archiving, because these images exist on the internet. Now, when I'm looking up references for Uli, I also see these images being included. That is the legacy, that is the archive. I no longer have to see images from, like, even though they are still included as they should be, but we don't have to go to see 20 years into the past to see reference images. This is an act of cultural preservation. So part of my story personally when it comes to fashion is the act of preserving elements of culture so that there is a reference point for people to turn back to. So when you're creating your work, and I'm really speaking to image makers at this point, and when you're creating your images, is where do you want your work to live? Do you want it to live in museums? Do you want it to live in research papers? This is the legacy. And when I say legacy, I'm not just talking about your name, because eventually your name will die out. I'm sorry. But the images and the story can still be a reference point for other people. who are we creating for? Who are we honoring? We're honoring members of certain communities. We're honoring their legacies. This was a story that I did with National Geographic around indigenous identities. I actually worked with Nelson on this story, so shout out to Nelson on that. And the main part of this story, which was funny for National Geographic, was that I asked them for a stylist. I said a main part of this is how people will choose to express themselves, will choose to express their indigenous identity. When you even look at images like this, you might not necessarily think indigenous identity, but these everyday pieces were handpicked by the individuals to express who they were, what their indigenous core was. Yep. So people who want to make a place for themselves, people who are carving out a space for themselves and their own worlds and for their safety, this is who I create the images for. It doesn't necessarily mean, so for example, I'll be quite transparent with you. When when they reached out to me about this, I knew exactly the sorts of images they wanted. They wanted tribal, they wanted ethnic. They wanted the old school National Geographic. But I told them very clearly that I also would like to create a sort of physical archive, especially when it comes to the print, that when people think about African culture, when people think about African indigenous identity, what else is there? Because guess what? Culture is not stagnant. Fashion is not stagnant. It is forever evolving. So I would want to add something into the legacy, in this case of National Geographic. When you open it and you see something around African peoples, it's more than what they were showing in the 80s when they were really booming on their exotification of Black people. And the most important part, and this is the overall of it, is you have to care. Ethics, ethics, ethics. And when I say ethics, it's the people that you're working with. You have to actively care, right down to the stylists, the assistants, the models. An example of this is this body of work I did called The Consumption of the Male Model, of the Black Model. And I created this in a time, I don't know if you guys remember, some years ago, maybe 5, 6 years ago, where there were a lot of international brands coming to Ghana, going to Accra, going to Lagos, and they were specifically looking for styling, their models quite well here on the continent. But I would see fantastically styled pieces on these beautiful Black models, but then I would see like an iron placed on the model's head. And I would pause and say, or there would be a bucket on the model's head, or something, some random object on the model's head. And it was this question of just like, what is the point of this? Are we looking at the clothes, or are we using a person as simply a body? And I started to question also the comfort that the model has in terms of their involvement in how they are represented. So Consumption of the Male Model really questioned how we treat our models that we work with when we're trying to convey a story. And this is a very practical photo shoot I did, in the sense of working with the model, telling them what my idea was, ensuring that they were comfortable with it. This is what I would like you to do. This is the outfit you'll be wearing. Are you comfortable wearing a dress? Are you comfortable with someone squeezing juice on your head? All of this, consent. Even if the model is paid, there shouldn't be this assumption of, yeah, you're good, you're paid, we can do whatever we want with you. You have to care to create strong images. And it ties also to longevity, because these images were, I can't remember the name of the museum in Germany that they have now been collected at. And I think like if I'd created other images more lightly or more carelessly, I wouldn't have that. And I'm speaking for myself in terms of my personal goals and where I want my work to live and how I want it to live. But also with this body of work, it was a question that I put out to African creators in terms of, when you create, especially fashion images where the consumption of it is so quick, who are you creating for? Myself included, a lot of my work goes out to Western publications, goes out to Western media. But the question I ask myself is, am I creating my type of work specifically to appeal to them? Or am I creating the work that I want to exist first and letting them know that they can share it if they want, but I am not creating this work for them? And an example of a brand that I really like when it comes to using fashion as a tool for storytelling is Ekikere. And I swear this is not sponsored because I am wearing Ekikere, but it just so happens to be the truth in terms of them just really embedding the elements of storytelling, meaning, and memory into their work. And it's a fashion brand that I believe here in Lagos has done successfully, very successfully well in the last, I think, 3+ years or something like that, in sticking to their original story. And I'm just so glad that personally I found a designer to continually work with where we understand each other's viewpoints, especially when it comes to representation, especially when it comes to expression. And then we have storytelling, we have care, we have archiving, but I think in order to tell a good story sometimes, but not always, but honestly, in my case, most times, is research and creating references. Because once again, is I've given you examples of going to communities and looking at real people and drawing inspiration from them. Those are some of my references, but also recording the references or the points of inspirations that you find. In this case, I'm going to show you some images from a grant work that I did called Another Tale by Moonlight that referenced some fairy tales, but also used strong elements of fashion to pass social and political commentary. So here we have, if people are familiar with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and we have some reference images. I think this was from Life magazine or something like that, of Queen Elizabeth back in the late 1950s when she was visiting Nigeria. And take note of all these points. And then with that, I created this image, which is essentially a statement on the colonial influence and impact that we've had. I used the reference of Goldilocks has now become Queen Elizabeth, got the dress tailored to really drive the point home. In the fairy tale of Goldilocks, Goldilocks was, in all actuality, an intruder. She entered the home, she broke into the home of the three bears, ate all their food, and then slept in all their beds. And after making a mess of things, was like, I'm out, and ran out. You know, so I now used Goldilocks to reference Queen Elizabeth. I had these masquerades made to sort of represent the three major ethnic groups. I know this is a sort of like that tired trope because we're so much more diverse, but it is such a recognizable thing when it comes to the three. And they have essentially killed their intruder, which is my reference and statement and personal viewpoints in terms of what do we do with our colonial remnants here. Another reference is, and I also sometimes like to use my own images I took over the years of schoolgirls. I think as you travel around the continent, our school uniforms is also a colonial remnant, and they're very recognizable. You know, when you're walking down the street, you can tell what's a school uniform or what is some sort of uniform, even if it's like hairdressing school and whatnot. And then I have a reference of Snow White encased in her glass coffin, and this was to address the very abysmal state of education in Nigeria, where Snow White has now become a young schoolgirl, encased behind her glass coffin, waiting to be rescued someday, maybe, or is she just going to be entombed there, frozen forever? We don't know. And then the last one that I'm going to show you before we jump into our conversation is one of my favorite stories. It's The Emperor Has No Clothes. Are people familiar with some of these fairy tales? If not, please look it up. And we also have a reference image from, I'm going to mess it up because the English never loved us, the Elizabethan era with the, giant ruffles. And then I really wanted to make a statement on plastic pollution. And with that, I created this image. And once again, there were all these fashion references that I had to do my research on and then insert it into my work, where the emperor does have clothes in this case, but the clothes are this sort of very fashion Tudorian outfits. I collected pure water sachets and made the outfit, including the recycled collar out of water bottles. And he's dressed like some sort of aristocrat, covered and littered with plastics, but in a way almost oblivious to it, as a sort of statement to really the people in power who are able to do something, who should be able to do something around our issue of plastic pollution, but are not doing that. In total, I would say that all my work, archiving, storytelling, all of it just deeply comes from a place of care. And even if it's something as little as, what I said earlier in terms of respecting the models or respecting your tailors and whatnot, is you simply cannot create good work if you do not care. That's it. Thank you.